Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Marci Alboher. She is one of the nation's leading authorities on career issues and workplace trends, and she's a vice president at Encore.org. Her current focus is on the power of connecting, collaborating, and innovating across the generations. Marci is a former blogger, columnist for the New York Times, and her last book was called The Encore Career Handbook. She's been on NBC, Today Show, Nightly News, a bunch of other amazing places. And now she is with us. So welcome today, Marci. How are you?
It's nice to be here.
Cool. So you've got an interesting perspective because you're on both sides of this fence, if you will, right? So you've been the thought leader, you are a thought leader. But I want to talk a little bit about Encore and how Encore strategically uses thought leadership to achieve its objectives. Now, Encore is a nonprofit, so tell us first maybe a little bit about what Encore is.
So Encore is a nonprofit, and we've been around for 20 years, founded by Mark Friedman, my colleague Mark, who is still the CEO of Encore. And he's really one of the biggest thought leaders in the whole aging, longevity, reinventing retirement space. Mark's written 5 books in this field. He's out on the speaking circuit and talks to the media regularly. So Mark has always, since the founding of Encore, had a vision for an organization that would work to change the culture through both changing the conversation, we call it changing the narrative, and through piloting innovative programs that would change the way the world looks. So his philosophy, which all of us at Encore believe in, is that if you're going to change the culture, you got to change the story and you got to change society and the norms of society. So our work has always been about developing these innovative programs that I'll tell you a little about, many of which are storytelling programs, and then also identifying leaders and working with large communities of leaders, networks of leaders. So while Mark has always been a major thought leader in this space, we've always believed in kind of amplifying the voices of the many leaders in our movement. And our movement is around changing the story of longer lives and therefore the intergenerational opportunity of the time that we're living in. So as you know, we're an aging society. We now have more people over the age of 60 than under the age of 18. And I think in this moment of COVID-19, we've seen so much, right? What it means to have an older society. And our position has always been that older people are assets in society and in our communities. And we've done a lot to tell the story of how older people enhance society, how older people serve, how older people are necessary in society. And increasingly, our work is about how older people can collaborate and partner with and support younger people to create a better world for all of us. So that's the mission. Yeah.
Got it. So that's the mission. So number one, given that it's a nonprofit, we're developing thought leadership not to sell and directly monetize or even indirectly monetize, but the successful deployment of thought leadership from Encore would lead to people engaging in programs, people becoming part of the movement, people becoming part of the community, donating, whatever the case may be. So can you give us some examples of maybe a goal or two that the organization's trying to accomplish and how thought leadership is contributing to that? Might not be the only variable, but it's a significant one.
I'll give you 2 examples of from our history and then something that's very current we're doing. So historically, we've wanted to reposition older people as assets in society and as change makers in society. So we started a program called the Purpose Prize, which gave out large cash awards, $100,000 prizes to social innovators over the age of 60. Instead of honoring, the person who created the latest app, sitting, above their parents' garage, we honored people like a social worker who, after 40 years, came up with a way not to separate siblings in the foster care system, or some innovation in the social sphere. So over the course of 10 years, we honored 500 social innovators. We gave away $5 million. And we started to tell a new story of how to be a change maker over the age of 60. And 3 years ago, AARP took over that prize. So one of the ways we've influenced the aging space is that the largest aging organization in the world adopted one of our programs to take an asset framing, and it's part of their Disrupt Aging campaign. They now run the AARP Purpose Prize, which we created. So for us, success in changing the conversation means that influencers are listening. So the Purpose Prize always garnered all kinds of publicity, got media coverage in every major media outlet you could think of. But I think the biggest sign of influence is that AARP thought it was worth adopting that program.
Right. So they not only took it over, but pre to that, they had to be aware of it. Then they had to acknowledge it, recognize it, and go, wow, this is actually aligned with one of our goals, right? So in the non-nonprofit world or the for-profit world, that might have been called an acquisition, right? Where they took this asset from you because it had value to them. So that's pretty cool. So when you compare thought leadership, broadly defined, against some of the other programmatic things that you do, how does it compare? Right. So
here's a good example. So another program that is trying to change the culture, we have a program called Encore Fellowships. So as you probably know, people are working longer and living longer, but a lot of people, hit their 50s and 60s and are trying to figure out how to make a shift to an Encore career. And one thing we found is that a lot of people were really craving meaning and purpose at that part of life. So we created a one-year fellowship for professionals who wanted to move from the corporate sector to the social sector. So people who want to work in a nonprofit or a social change organization. And we created a one-year fellowship to do that. And over the past 10 years, we've matched more than 2,000 people in those kinds of fellowships. And most of them are now working in the nonprofit sector, and they have made a successful transition. And there was never a pathway to do that kind of program. So for us, that also becomes a source of stories that we can tell to the media. So we are in touch with media reporters all the time who want stories about career changers and who want stories about people who are finding
so now you have these embedded fellows in dozens or hundreds or whatever many companies. And when the reporter comes with you for a story, it's not just blah, blah, blah interview, but let me tell you about Sally Smith, who was a CFO at a financial services company and is now
now like the, head of accounting for the Red Cross or for some nonprofit. So we have a story that tells that shapes the new narrative, that helps people envision what that looks like. So that's another example. So
if you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So what I was thinking is there's in traditional thought leadership, when it's an individual that's the author, the speaker, the whatever, things work in a certain way, right? You have an idea, you do stuff with that idea, you put in a book, you put in an article, speak, it resonates, rinse, lather, repeat. When it's an organization, and I was going back to sort of extracting the content forensically from the fellowship, it doesn't have to be one person at the organization that is the author. So your role, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, at Encore is not to be sort of the equivalent of the author of everything Encore, but it's really the curation, the extraction, you're the editor-in-chief, if you will, or just to sort of explain the differences between the two functions, because it's interesting.
So we do both.
Yes.
So Mark writes and speaks all the time, and his writing and speaking kind of helps to bring these ideas to the fore, both to get quoted in the media, to influence other innovators. Sure. I mean, we know the Purpose Prize, for example. There is now a Purpose Prize in Germany that was inspired by our Purpose Prize, starting a whole conversation in that country about purpose in later life. The Encore Fellowships program now exists in the UK because our work was cited and became a model for others. So
and that's probably attributable to Mark as sort of the traditional, the rock star. He's the face of the brand, if you will.
Yes, but those are not just kind of Mark's vanity project. Those are programs with program leaders, and the program leaders are out there talking about those programs. Mark does his speaking off of his latest book, How to Live Forever.
Mm-hmm.
So that sparks all kinds of activities. But a big part of our theory is that aging and longevity doesn't look the same in all communities, doesn't look the
Right.
same for
Mm-hmm.
everyone. And it's really important to us that there are many different narratives out there and many different speakers on these topics. So, for example, we launched a new fellowship 2 years ago called the Encore Public Voices Fellowship, which is a partnership with the Op-Ed Project. And our
Great.
mission in that fellowship is to support a cadre of diverse voices talking at the intersection of longevity, aging, and intergenerational issues and social justice. And we've supported so far 40 fellows in
Mm-hmm.
that initiative. They are diverse in every way.
Sure.
Culturally,
Yep.
geographically, age diverse. We've had fellows
Mm-hmm.
from the age of 20 to 80 in that fellowship who care
Very
about these
cool.
issues. So now when the media knocks on the door and says, I want to interview someone to talk about issues going right now in the middle of COVID, we are getting media knocking on our
Mm-hmm.
door all the time saying, what's going on with intergenerational programs? How are
Yep.
people connecting the generations in a time where older and younger people are told to stay apart? Well, I can actually go to my Public Voices fellows and they have examples of what's going on in their communities and they can speak, because we can't speak to every community in the
Sure.
country about how this is playing out.
So
We
I
can,
so I think that thinking works in profits, for profits and nonprofits, where it is not the job of one individual to be the only voice of the organization on everything, whether that's a consulting firm on AI or a tech firm on something else, or in your case on the intergenerational piece. But you do have to have someone in charge of sort of organizing it and being able to extract it and curating it and coaching it and all those sort of things, which are very different functions, because you have to set the agenda, right, of what's
Mhm.
needed, and then you have to know where to go. And it actually, this sort of crowdsourcing or democratization of the content is a bit different than the way we typically develop ideas and thoughts.
Right. So we're trying to create a movement, not sell a
Right.
product, right? We're trying to change the culture. And we're also trying to make sure that underrepresented perspectives are part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So we have learned over time that we are a gatekeeper, and
Yep.
particularly with the media and for, conferences are looking for speakers, or so
Yep.
we know that people are coming to us
Yep.
for we're a think tank in that respect. So
Sure.
people are
Sure.
coming to us like, who is the researcher I should talk to? Who's the community leader I should talk to?
Mm-hmm.
So it's useful for us and for the goals that we have. And I think in a way it's hard to think about, if a company is trying to kind of be known as a leader in a space, often they do want one singular voice. But if they're really trying to change behavior, for example, in some kind of way, they may find that it's really useful to have many different kinds of spokespeople or many different kind of thought leaders out there, because different thought leaders often speak to different audiences. So
Well,
here's
and I
an
think
yeah.
that's a key point. So what I've seen at the organizational level with thought leadership is a couple of layers of that. Number one is, irregardless of how brilliant or how smart that one person is, they're not brilliant and smart in everything to all people all the time, right? That's just not going to happen. I think when it's done well, most organizations have lots and lots and lots of really smart people working for them, but their voices aren't heard because it's not part of their job description or their functional piece, or they don't think of themselves as a writer, or maybe they're too technical and writing's not their thing, etc. But if you put the thought and the effort in, there are systems and processes and methods and stuff that you could put in place to say, we can take a great story on X, Y, and Z from, Charlie, who's our greatest systems engineer, or Fred, who's over in Africa, or Sally, who's over here. It's like knowing what people have thought leadership on or the potential to contribute in, and then creating systems of, doesn't have to be financial, but recognition. Even the intrinsic, people like to tell their stories and see it documented. And there's an intrinsic satisfaction of sort of having folks do that.
Yes, and you can also connect with different kinds of audiences and customers
Mm-hmm.
if you have different people speaking about the ideas and the way that your product or service resonates, right? So you can hit people of different ages, you can get people through
Right.
different social media channels because
So
you're
in your case, so on the intergenerational piece, it's sort of a one-hit wonder if we're only hearing about the perspective of a 65-year-old white male,
Right.
versus
Right.
hearing various voices on that, be it a 26-year-old or a 48-year-old, or where they're geographically located, racial issues, all that stuff. And it shouldn't be a one trick pony.
So I think one thing that's so interesting is the way the conversation around ageism has shifted now that there are younger people talking about what it feels like that there are an absence of older people in their field. So for example,
Right,
when you
right.
have a young person in their 20s saying, I can't find a mentor because they've all been aged out of my workplace, that's a very effective way to have a conversation about ageism rather than just having a bunch of 65-year-olds say,
Right.
I've been a product of age discrimination. So I think it's pretty important to get different perspectives if you're really trying to change the culture and change behavior.
Yeah, yeah. So let me ask you this then. How, any program that you have, even though it's a nonprofit, you have to justify its existence based on its impact, its return on
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
investment, that it's achieving its objectives. What are the metrics that you put in place? And can you give an example or two of, wow,
I
this thing
can.
just hit it out of the park?
Yes, I can. So here's an example of how we look at metrics. We trace things that happen. So for example,
Hmm.
Mark, our founder,
Yep.
wrote a note to our email list. I'm sure all
Sure.
CEOs do that, in the current pandemic environment. And he wrote about what it meant for us and our movement. And he was contacted by a Wall Street Journal reporter who wanted to talk about the separation between older and younger
Hmm.
in this period because Mark had written about it very eloquently in our newsletter.
Hmm.
His story about how he and his kids were connecting with his mother over video was featured on
Yep.
the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, very
So
cool.
that's an example. I'm sure, in any setting that is considered a home run.
Sure.
One of our Public Voices fellows, Alex Smith in the UK, has a really compelling organization in London that's attacking the loneliness epidemic. And they've
Hmm.
got
Hmm.
30,000 people in the UK that are older and younger neighbors that are connecting together over like intergenerational dance parties and all kinds
Oh,
of
wow.
older and
Great.
younger. But right now, when older and younger can't be together, he's trying to innovate. Their community is trying to figure out what are the new ways that people can connect. So he wrote an article about that in the Huffington Post.
Yep.
Barack Obama tweeted it. So that was,
Wow.
for
Okay.
us, a home run. So same thing, like
Wait. So the
having,
bar's pretty high. So a Barack retweet and the
and the
cover
Wall
of the
Street
Wall
Journal,
Street Journal. So,
these are
okay.
considered successful. So,
I
we
would say.
care about eyeballs. We care about eyeballs because we
Sure.
know we're trying to influence the public dialogue so that policymakers pay attention, so that funders pay attention and think about funding the kinds of programs that are, and the kinds of efforts that are going to
Hmm.
change the structures of the world that we live in. So we don't want everybody to have to just figure out their own
Sure.
fix for how to be less isolated. We want more structural changes that will help us be less isolated in the first place.
Got it. So as we start to wrap, thinking out in the next year, 3, 5, do you think there'll be increases in investments that organizations make in thought leadership? Will it stay the same? Will it go down?
It's funny. I think you're one of the people who told me that you searched the words thought leadership on LinkedIn and suddenly it was showing up in people's job titles. And I think that was a very
3,300 as of
yes,
yesterday.
yes. So I'm going to quote you, Peter. So I think there is something there. I gave myself a new title this year. I called myself head of narrative change efforts. I think we're seeing more of these kind of interesting titles that have to do with the power of storytelling to change the conversation,
Yeah.
change behavior. So I do think that thought leadership is becoming increasingly important in all spheres to
Yeah.
how we shift the public dialogue. And it is, of course, then gets harder and harder to break through the noise, right? And to think about how to be creative and how to capture the public consciousness. So
Yeah.
I think that's where people are being there's always going to be, you have to be a few steps ahead of the game.
Sure. And any sense as to if it's growing, usually, particularly in the nonprofits, but at all organizations, the pie doesn't necessarily grow equally. It's usually at the expense of. So, what do you think? What type of initiatives might be at risk as thought leadership grows as a capability, as a function, as a way to achieve a business objective?
That's a really interesting question. I don't look at things as having a zero sum. I think you can I think if you're doing thought leadership well, it can really help advance all your other goals.
Hmm.
If you're trying to change behavior in any way, and if you're trying to change the culture, it really, really helps to change the story and to use storytelling.
Hmm.
Here's a perfect example of what I think we're seeing right now. And I keep taking it back to the current moment because it's all on our minds. I think Governor Cuomo in New York is doing an incredible job of connecting by humanizing this story. In every single press conference, he's
Yeah.
telling the story of his own family in ways that we can all relate to. It is so personal.
Yeah. He's mentioning his kids and the right,
His
right.
mother, his brother. I
Yep.
mean, it's
Yep.
all coming to life in such a real
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And I think
Very
he's
cool.
taken a moment to show that he's not just a leader, but he is using thought leadership
Sure.
in getting us. He's taken over that press conference, which is now broadcast nationally, not just
Yeah.
in New York.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and
No, it's the
that's thought
pulse of
leadership.
what's
Yeah,
happening. Yeah.
that's
Fantastic. Well, this has been great. I appreciate your time and your insights. This has been fantastic. And thank you so much.
my pleasure, Peter.
If you enjoyed this episode, and I do hope that you did, please join our new LinkedIn group, which is exclusively focused on the organizational thought leader, the person in the corporate world that is using thought leadership as part of their job, whether that's developing thought leadership, whether that's deploying thought leadership, whether that's helping others do so. Please take a look and check out our LinkedIn group. We think you'd get a lot of benefit from that. Thank you.